Hi there, and welcome to our session, The Sciences of Reading, and a conversation with two reading educators who have been around the block. I'm Dr. Harrington. I'm a teaching associate professor of elementary and reading education at North Carolina State University.
And I'm Ivey, and I am a professor in literacy at UNC Greensboro.
So we wanted to begin by first sharing the references that we will be mentioning today in our talk. Yes, today's talk will be a talk. It's going to be a conversation, but it's also grounded in research theory and evidence. So the link to our references, if you would like to see them, go.ncsu.edu/NCRA 2021 references. And I'll leave it here for just a second. go.ncsu.edu/NCRA 2021 references. And we encourage you to take a look at those after you view our session today. So let's start with introductions. Again, my name is Ann Harrington. I'll be starting my 33rd year as an educator. Almost all of my years in North Carolina, a few years in Georgia. My undergraduate work was at UNC Chapel Hill in early childhood and elementary education. My master's work was also at UNC Chapel Hill in reading education, learning disabilities. And then my PhD work was at University of Georgia in reading education. And I also obtained certification in English as a second language. I started my career as an elementary school classroom teacher. I've taught every grade, 1st through 5th, never kindergarten. And I've also served as a reading specialist and an ESL teacher, as well as multiple internships in the summer in special education settings. In terms of my work as a teacher educator, I have had the privilege of serving on the faculty at UNC Greensboro, UNC Chapel Hill, and now at North Carolina State University.
I'm Ivey, and I think I'll start with where I am now and then go backwards. As I said, I'm a professor of literacy at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I just finished my 4th year. And not only have I been here, 4th year here, not only have I been around the block in terms of reading and reading policies and reading research, I've been around the block in terms of places I've worked. Prior to coming here to North Carolina, I was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And prior to that, I held positions at James Madison University in Virginia, University of Maryland College Park, and Rutgers University in New Jersey. Like Ann, I got my PhD in reading education from the University of Georgia. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. My master's degree is also in reading education from the University of Virginia. And my undergraduate work was in English at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. You got that Virginia link there. I was born and raised in Virginia, but importantly, my parents are actually from North Carolina. It's one of the things that brought me back here. My parents were born and raised in Robeson County. And that's a place where I still have family. And so coming back to North Carolina was really important to me because I felt it was sort of part of my personal and professional mission. My teaching experience, I was in the classroom nearly as long as Ann or probably many of you, but I was a Title I reading teacher and reading specialist in Albemarle County, Virginia. A lot of what I learned there really sort of propelled me to pursue particular questions in my research. For the past, I don't even want to count how long it is now, I have been conducting classroom-based research, mainly on reading, everywhere from the primary grades through high school. If you look me up, you'll find that I'm situated pretty firmly in middle school, but here recently, I've spent much time in kindergarten and 1st grade classrooms here in the state of North Carolina. So we're excited to get the opportunity to talk with you today.
Yeah, so we're sharing our information just to let you know a little bit about who we are, but to say that we really have been around the block. We have experienced in our, gosh, Gay, 60 plus years of experience as educators, many trends in reading instruction, K-12, many trends in reading teacher education, and we feel well positioned to talk about this current era that we're in. So our journey, as Gay mentioned, that we were both doctoral students together at the University of Georgia when we were studying reading education, and we found then our common interest and passion for reading instruction. So we are people who value greatly the way that reading is taught in K-8 settings, and now also as reading teacher educators. So while Gay, you and I do have some differences, I think in some places of perspectives and opinions, we share that passion. We care so much about reading instruction in and beyond North Carolina.
So the kind of conversation that you'll hear from us today is very similar to the kinds of conversations Ann and I have been having for decades now. So this is not new for us. And our passion for this hasn't waned over the years. It's probably increased.
Yes, I agree. So we hope today to do what Gay just said, kind of capture some of the conversations that we have been having of late connected to what's been called the science of reading. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So here first, if we were doing this in a face-to-face setting, we would now have you do some introduction. So here's who we think you are listening to this presentation today. We think you are dedicated and thoughtful educators and administrators who have made it through this school year. So we first want to just say congratulations and thank you. To say that this has been a school year like no other is an understatement. We also think that you are people who understand there is no quick fix when it comes to increasing the reading achievement of all children. And as human beings, wouldn't it be nice to have some quick fixes? But we think you all know that it doesn't happen that way when it comes to reading instruction and reading achievement for children. And we also think you are people who want to advocate for quality and equitable reading instruction that truly all children deserve. So, Gay, what do you think about our audience today?
I think it's amazing that you're tuning in over the summer, and I think that speaks to your dedication. Like Ann, I think you've probably had a heck of a year, and so kudos to you for tuning in today, and hope you should relax and sort of take it in. If you have ever, as we get through this, we both can be contacted at our respective universities. And so if you have questions about anything that we talk about, we would like to be face-to-face with you, and we would certainly take questions if we were face-to-face. And so if you find later that you'd like to have a conversation, we're both open to that.
That sounds great. So again, thank you for being here today. And we look forward to having a conversation with one another and perhaps with you as well. So to start, the title of our session, The Sciences of Reading, and we are looking at the S in the sciences of reading to suggest, as we'll be talking more about, that there is science behind many other practices and literacy instruction, both within and beyond what are now being called the foundations of reading or the pillars of reading. And we'd also like to add about the and that we also know, give me one second here. We also know that there's more to children's reading achievement than just what goes on in literacy instruction. So the and is that we know there are factors inside and outside of school that also affect children's reading achievement. So in our conversation today, we're going to be focusing on, yes, what's traditionally called the science of reading, but thinking about that S at the end of science and thinking about some of those and factors. So Gay, are you ready to jump in?
Yes, and just as a disclaimer, and this is coming up, I don't like even the phrase sciences of reading. We're using that today for a purpose, but a little later on, I'll talk about that and why I'm trying not to use that. But carry on.
All right, let's go. So we're going to start with some questions that are going to guide our conversation today. And so we're going to kind of frame our talk today around these 4 questions. And those 4 questions are connected to, as Gay said, the science of reading, but we're going beyond that. So first, I just wanted to pause, and you may have already seen this definition, but here is how our North Carolina Department of Public Instruction defines the science of reading. And I'll give you a minute just to read this. Because, you know, there are lots of definitions of what the science of reading is and includes and how it's translated, but we thought it could be helpful just to share this working definition to start. And notice in particular the second part here that it's tied to the National Reading Panel report of 2000. So that's where the 5 pillars or the foundations of reading connect to this work. We'll be talking more about that as well. So here is our first question.
And what's worrying you?
What's worrying me? Right. So, you know, I'm a worrier. Lots of things worry. Yes, right. But let's talk today about what's worrying us connected to the science of reading. So I'd say one thing, Gay, that's really worrying me is that I'm afraid that the science of reading is being promoted as a quick fix. And really, quick fixes don't really fix. And so to tell teachers, for example, that if you just focus your instruction on the science of reading, you just focus on those foundational aspects of reading or the pillars of reading, that the issue of children's reading achievement will be solved. We know from being around the block that that's just not the case. So one worry is that this is kind of being seen now, science of reading, as a quick fix, when in actuality, we know that we need to provide evidence-based, quality, equitable literacy instruction for all children. And certainly the foundations of reading are a crucial part of that, but it's only one part. And lately, I've really been interested in Gholdy Muhammad's work. She talks about the fact that if it was just about teaching reading skills and strategies in isolation, if we've been doing that for years, we would not have reading achievement issues now. But her point is just that skills only teaching we know has not worked in the past. We have no evidence that it's going to work now. So we have to think about a broader conception of what literacy instructions should include. So those are just a couple of my worries, Gay, that science of reading is not a quick fix and that we have to look at the kind of literacy instruction that all children deserve. So tell me, for you, what's worrying you in conjunction to the science of reading?
Well, before I get to some of this stuff, I want to comment on some things that you said. I mean, the truth is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but there have been supposed quick fixes, silver bullets, for as long as I can remember. That it turned out that everybody said, this is a silver bullet. This is it. And that's never been the case. And so the idea that we're still fighting the idea of quick fixes all these years later is pretty amazing. But some of the worries that I have, and I alluded to one earlier, what is that the language that is being used presently, I believe, to silence skepticism and perhaps to silence teachers or those who worry about some of the political decisions being made. Words like science, I think, and sciences have been sort of weaponized to sort of set up, a dichotomy between the people who are in the know, the authority, as if there is an authority, and then the people who don't know, who need to be taught. And so some of the language really bothers me, the language that I'm hearing now, because language matters and language shapes the way people see things. So some additional phrases, one that's bothered me for a long time is research says. A friend of mine says all the time, and I also sort of ascribe to this, that research doesn't say anything. Researchers say things, not research. Where researchers say things, and we have researchers who have a lot of different perspectives on things. And so the idea that research says anything, it doesn't say nothing, but the idea that it's the end all be all, or that it gives you some sort of truth is just not true. The other the language that is bugging me is, I hear that the science of reading, or principles of the science of reading, are, quote, settled science. The idea of settled science as a phrase is sort of an oxymoron. That's not how science works. Nothing's really settled. If so, we would still believe that the world was flat. And so, I think different things certainly than I did when when you and I first met.
Yes.
We've both sort of changed based on evolving evidence. And so nothing's ever settled. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but some of the research that's being invoked presently, it's now 30 or 40 years old. Right. And we've certainly learned a lot since then. And just like with your teaching, in your classrooms, for those of you who are listening to the conversation, you probably haven't settled on anything because you haven't found something that works for all kids. This is true of research. And so, again, I think that words like settled are used as a weapon, or are used to silence questions or skepticism. The other thing that worries me is the way that research in general is being invoked. The first thing I wonder, Anne, is how many people out there who are making political decisions, or who are enforcing political decisions, have had access to actual research. Because you and I know, as scholars in education, people who have studied how to do and how to understand research, know that it's a complicated matter. And so, some examples of that would be, it's never enough, even if you have access to actual research and not sound bites or bullet points from a PowerPoint. And I'm afraid there's a lot of that going around, of people getting their research information because there was a bullet. And we did that. We're going to have bullet points. And so, we don't want anybody taking this either and saying, here's the truth. That's why we gave a link to the references. But it's certainly not enough to read bullet points that give summaries of research or findings from the search. It's never even enough to skim an actual article and go to the results section, because it's the intricacies of research and of methodology and so forth that really matter. So for example, when there is research on reading interventions, which is better? Is this kind of instruction better, or is this better? What you get in the end is whether or not something was statistically significant. In other words, was the change caused by intervention A statistically greater than the change caused by intervention B? But what you're getting is an average. Was the average change from intervention A greater than the average change in intervention B? And on average, in that study, there were participants who did a whole lot better than the average for a particular intervention. There were also kids who got worse as a result of the intervention. This represents the variety in a person's classroom. You don't have an on average class either. And so the idea that that sort of we can apply research findings in that way to mean this is good for all kids or this works for all kids, that's never the case. The other, I guess, question that I wonder if people ask when they read research, Anne, is whether or not they look at whether it had any sort of practical meaning. You might find that intervention A was more effective than intervention B, but in reality, when you looked at actual numbers, maybe intervention A moved kids from the 15th percentile to the 17th percentile over a 6-month intervention period, which wouldn't be anything to write home about. Right. Gerald Bracy, who was he is I think no longer with us, but he wrote a book probably 15 years ago. And the subtitle was something, it was for teachers about how not to get snookered by the statistics. Remember that? Do you remember that book, Anne?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's worth reading, I think, but some of these things come up. The other thing that people don't think about when reading research is, we look at what studies are out there published. What do we have evidence for? There's lots of research done that never gets published for lots of reasons, because the journal wasn't interested in it, or it got a researcher can decide they did a study, it didn't get the results they wanted, so they choose not to try to publish it. So, it's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing in some way. And then another issue that I would worry about that it's, even if you're reading the research, that oftentimes the side effects of a particular intervention are not reported. So if children got better at reading pseudo words, but those same children had their hair fall out of anxiety.
Right. Right.
Or, they stopped wanting to come to school, those kinds of, because of the intervention lacked personal meaning for them. Those are the really important things. Or something, do you know, Anne, did you read the book by Yang Zhao on side effects? There was a whole book written a couple of years ago by Yang Zhao, and he talked about the fact that side effects aren't reported. And he said, if we're going to invoke the medical field for how we look at research and education, then we need to abide by the same principles. So the Food and Drug Administration, when they're doing tests and trials of particular medicines, they have to report side effects. And so if we're going to go there, and I'm not suggesting that we do, but if we're going to go there, if we're saying that's our gold standard for research and certain kinds of research, then we need to also look at side effects. I mean, I could go on all day, but I think that it's a serious matter when people are invoking research, and I really worry that when people invoke particular kinds of research and studies, they may not have all the information they need. And that consumers of workshops, consumers of publications, of talks, of policies, might not have access to the kinds of information I'm talking about.
Right. I mean, I agree completely with your concerns, Gay. I mean, I attended a Nell Duke webinar earlier this week, and she summarized it something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, she's concerned that so many people who are talking about the science of reading don't really understand the science of reading, and so many people who are talking about reading research are not the ones who are actually reading research. So to me, it's all about helping educators, administrators, all of us to become, like you said, critical consumers of reading research, to know what the research really does say, does not say, implications we should and should not draw from this research. That really is what it's all about. So no, your concerns are valid, and I share those concerns, definitely.
Well, and it's really important, I think, that we can't expect busy teachers who are doing a million things and maybe working on advanced degrees and so forth to become absolute experts in reading original research. I think it's enough to say that we should all be skeptics.
Yeah.
It's enough to say we should at least be skeptics and try to seek out as much information that we can, but just not to accept things. When people say research says, or here's a study that proves, be leery of that.
Right. No, I think that is a perfect starting point. Exactly. All right. Well, Gay, we've got a lot of concerns, a lot of worries. So let me go to a next question. Question is, and we've talked a lot about this, how did we get here? So talking a little bit about the history of this current science of reading emphasis. And I do love this quote about those, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what happened with reading instruction in elementary schools 20-ish years ago and how it has some parallels with today. So Gay, how do we get here? What's some of the history of this current science of reading emphasis?
Oh my goodness. And Anne, this is making me feel really old because I know that probably lots of people listening in were very young in
Well,
the year
we
2000.
were young too. We were young
I
too.
was in a professor position at this point. So I remember this really, really well. In the late 1990s, the NIH convened a panel of people, most of them not educators, from various fields, some in educational psychology, I think just a couple of classroom teachers, but not necessarily people who studied reading per se, and to form a panel. And their charge was to examine the research in instructional research in early reading acquisition. And it's interesting that the takeaway these days, all these 20 some years later, is that there were certain components of reading instruction that emerged as the most important. Nothing can be further from the truth. These topics were pre-selected. So originally they started with alphabetics, fluency, and comprehension. They added some other areas: vocabulary, independent reading, teacher education, computers and technology and reading. One of the things that happened was that those last three, independent reading, teacher education, and computers technology, there weren't enough of the kind of studies they were looking for, controlled experiments with randomized assignment, that there weren't enough that met their criteria to be included for an analysis. And so it's not that those areas aren't important.
Right.
And that got miscommunicated too at the time. It's just that they looked at a very narrow body of research.
Right.
And ultimately they ended up with 5 areas. And these over time became known as the 5 pillars or the 5 essential components. You know them, and everybody knows these by heart by now.
Right.
Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. It's interesting if you go, and I think, and only geeks like us and some of our friends read the actual report. I wish I had it here. I'd show it.
Yeah.
And only geeks like us ever read it. There was a summary report that actually had some inconsistencies with the big report. And I think a lot of people didn't even read the summary report, but if they did, it wasn't necessarily consistent with the big report. And I think most people didn't read it. But the 5 pillars was not ever mentioned anywhere in that report. This was language that somebody used, and these were called the 5 essential components. And again, nothing could be further from the truth. And even if you go to the actual big fat green book, the report, and we've put a quote up here from the report, and even the panel said, it's not that other areas weren't important. It's just that our job was too big and there was too much research.
Right.
And you can see the quote there. And if I could change one thing, I think not just here, but across the country. And I've even heard fellow professors sort of perpetuate the myth that there are 5 pillars and that these emerged from the National Reading Panel report. If I could change one thing, I would get everybody to look at that and to stop saying that, because it's very misleading and it narrows the focus of what we do and what policymakers consider to be important. You all, I mean, one of the things that I bet people are already thinking about is, one thing that's missing here is motivation.
Right.
And that was a huge criticism at the time of this report. But a really important thing to know is that they started with these topics, didn't emerge from their study. So they could have started with other topics. Would we be calling those the 5 pillars if they had started? I don't know.
I don't know either. Yeah.
I don't know.
But that's a good point. And again, when we look back at that definition of the science of reading, almost all definitions you see have something to do with this 2000 National Reading Panel report, something to do with these so-called 5 pillars or the foundations of reading. So that's a great point. And in particular, Gay, I mean, we've talked a lot about what the National Reading Report actually says. And so I think the area of phonics is one that's particularly interesting. You want to share a few points about that?
Yeah, I think that the findings about phonics is very important.
Yes.
There's no debating the importance of kids knowing phonics,
Right.
as they learn to decode and hopefully become fluent readers. But the evidence is a lot less, well, it's more underwhelming, I think, than people realize if you go and actually read the report. There were only 38 studies that qualified, that met their criteria. And, you know, very few of the analyses they did had to do with the outcome of actual text reading.
Right.
It was about reading single words. And most of the comparisons they made came from studies where children were in first grade. There were much fewer in kindergarten, certainly fewer across grades 2 to 6. You know, I'll come back to this in a little while, but they reported at the time, so I'm giving you a cue to sort of listen up for something later. They reported at the time that systematic phonics, when compared to non-systematic phonics or no phonics, had an overall effect size of 0.44, which is really, it's only a moderate effect size. Mm-hmm. They also found that there was no one approach to phonics that was any better than any other. So synthetic phonics, analytic, you know, starting at the sort of a letter and sound level or a whole word, it didn't matter. There was no one approach that was better than another. I think something people might not be as aware of was the idea of that phonics instruction has diminishing effects after first grade in the studies that they looked at. And so you can see some of the other findings here, but you would think from the way this report is used in lots of places in the past 20 years, that there were much stronger findings than what the report actually showed. So it's a little underwhelming. So, I mean, anything that you notice about this that sticks out at you?
No, I think that, I mean, these are really important points to consider, right? That this National Reading Panel report, particularly in the areas of phonemic awareness and phonics, are cited all the time. And people make claims all the time about what the National Reading Panel report found, what's in it. And so to know what's actually in the report, what actually was found, it's really essential information. And again, this was over 20 years ago. Have we done much more research and learned much more about evidence-based phonics instruction since then? Yes, but when people cite this report, they need to know what it actually says and does not say.
I can't remember what the next slide is, Anne, but I'll say this before you talk about this. But what I remember, because this went along with reading first. What I remember from the time that the National, and I remember it was all a buzz when it came out, and all of us got our copies. And I don't think they were digital copies. I think we all got the big fat green copy. We got the, and because this was the Stone Ages. And you know, phonics and phonemic awareness were I think the first two areas that people really paid attention to. Phonemic awareness, I mean, people in research had talked about phonemic awareness for a very long time. And so people who studied it, people who are experts in reading, but you didn't hear much about it in schools. All of a sudden, there was this boom in books, articles, workshops, programs, all centered on, you know, that phonemic awareness was the big problem. That was the reason we had so many struggling readers, because kids didn't have phonemic awareness. It's interesting because I don't doubt the importance of phonemic awareness, but another thing that's never come out of research is which came first, the chicken or the egg, you know, in terms of phonemic awareness. You know, I don't doubt its importance, and I hope that we're teaching kids phonemic awareness, but it was another one that was overblown at the time. Because I've done a lot of work with older struggling readers, I remember encountering school districts that were purchasing phonemic awareness programs for 9th graders. If you can read some words, you don't really need phonemic awareness. Right. The other thing, we didn't mention this, but you know, similar to the findings for phonics, the findings for phonemic awareness, in comparison to how it was being blown out of proportion in policies and instruction, was that it had diminishing effects after kindergarten. And basically, phonemic awareness instruction helps you get better at phonemic awareness,
Right.
you know, and that's kind of where the buck stops. Not to, it is important, and I'm glad that that it really did expand people's understandings of all of the things that happen as children are acquiring reading skills, but it got blown out of proportion in lots of places. And then, but before you go on here, importantly, and then every other component of the was the silver bullet. We mentioned silver bullets earlier. Comprehension became the silver bullet, so everybody was teaching, you know, there were whole programs built around cognitive reading strategies. Vocabulary was for a while the silver bullet. That was everybody's problem. They didn't have good vocabulary instruction, you know, and I'm saying this, you know, tongue in cheek. Fluency was a big, and at the time I remember, and I wrote about this in a chapter, I called it the Reading Problem of the Month Club. Yeah. Because they went through all the areas as if that was the silver bullet. We've been here before, right, when everything, you know, whatever sub-skill was on the National Reading Panel report became the reading problem of the month. It didn't fix things.
Right. And to me, that really is the key point, Gay, right? Like people who, and I've heard people say this, that, you know, the science of reading, it's new research and we've not done this before. And if we were to just focus on science of reading instruction, that, you know, children's reading achievement would be improved dramatically. I mean, I think about how then the National Reading Panel report was used to inform what was then called Reading First. So for people who weren't around then, No Child Left Behind was grounded in this. And so the term here that I think, you know, I wanted to share is that at the time that states and districts received federal monies if they use what was then called scientifically based reading research. SBRR was the kind of the phrase then, and then the proven tools and that went along with that. So that's where we were in 2001. Doesn't that sound familiar? And I love just the way that Jim Cunningham has talked about this. So he says, well, okay, so what happened then with reading first when we emphasize the 5 pillars, particularly phonemic and phonics instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics instruction and isolation? There was a lot of intensive phonics instruction with highly decodable text. Certainly we're seeing that again now. Scripted lessons that teachers were expected to follow with fidelity. Lots of talk now about implementing reading instruction with fidelity. And the reading foundations were the emphasis, so much so that that's mostly all that was taught. And so if we look back at what we tried to do over 20 years ago under Reading First, using the National Reading Panel as a guide, here's what we did. And here are the outcomes that, you know, what did happen is that there was more time spent on the 5 pillars reading instruction, especially in the area of phonics. But what did not improve was students' reading comprehension. So that's to your point from earlier, Gay. Like, if all children are doing is that they can read a few more words on a list, or they can read a few more pseudo words, is that really practically significant if they're not able to actually read and comprehend text? Because that's, of course, what reading really is. So, you know, decoding and isolation is one component, but if they're not increasing their reading comprehension, I'm really, really concerned. So I don't want to go back to where we were 20 years ago, because we know what happened 20 years ago. I don't want to see that again now.
Well, and that, you know, it's deja vu all over again, because, you know, I want to remind you that Reading First, you know, which was an initiative where states could apply to the federal government for money. Right. And then if a state got it, then LEAs, local educational agencies, could apply to the state to become Reading First district, but you had to buy, like, you know, these certain kinds of programs that had these scientifically based. But it's interesting, and I don't want to get too political here, but that was a bipartisan effort at the federal level. And so here you had people from sort of different sides of the aisle agreeing on something that was just a bad idea. In the end, a bad idea. So that has happened. Yeah. So just because politicians can agree on something doesn't make it right.
Right. And again, you know, it may have been well-intentioned. Of course, we all care about children's reading achievements, but we have to do more than just have good intentions. And that's where we are. And so anyway, we've talked a lot about this, right? That it feels like in many ways we are going back to what we did 20 years ago, and we know what happened 20 years ago when this happened. So I think that leads us to our third question. And we could talk about some of these points for hours, and indeed we have. So I guess we'll just try to go through some of these briefly. What is some of the misinformation that we are reading and hearing connected to what's called the science of reading? And again, there is so much misinformation that's happening. So let's touch on a few of them. And I guess I can start. One thing that I have heard in multiple meetings now is that if we would just teach the foundations of reading, align with the science of reading, that, in so many words, we don't have to be concerned about children who live in poverty. We don't have to be concerned about these out of school factors. And that's simply not the case. So just a few references here. Children's lives outside of school matter. And so we think about like the Leandro decision here in North Carolina. I mean, we have to think about providing for children. They have to have food security. They have to have health care. They have to have mental health care. They have to have access to text. I mean, there's so much that goes on outside of school that does impact students' reading achievement. And I just feel so disheartened when teachers say, I'm doing everything that I can. I'm teaching reading so hard and I'm working all the time. And yet I still have children who are not yet reading on grade level. And they're teaching in these high poverty Title I schools. The answer is it has to be a holistic approach. Is reading instruction one essential part? Yes, but it's not the whole picture.
Well, and this view here that's troubling you puts too great of a burden on teachers alone.
Yes. It takes the village, as the proverb goes, and we're forgetting about the village, right? And then another bit of misinformation. I mean, this term balanced literacy instruction, and over again, we're reading and hearing that it's just another word for whole language, and it's a straw man, right? So if you know the history, and I had the privilege of studying under Dr. Dixie Spiegel many years ago, she wrote this article back in the day, 1992, blending whole language and direct instruction. The whole original idea behind balanced literacy instruction was you take that explicit systematic instruction of the reading foundations and you include all of the other aspects of literacy instruction that matter as well. For example, actually reading to children, reading with children, having children read, having children write, and those are thoughtfully combined and integrated. So this term is thrown around and misused a lot, and fine. If we want to use the term comprehensive instead of balanced, fine. But I do think it's important for people to understand what balanced literacy instruction really meant initially. And then just continuing with that, so we saw in our history that the use of, this is Jim Cunningham's term, highly decodable texts, that we don't want this to be all that children read. So we're hearing over and over again. I mean, you look on the web now and there are so many sites for selling these highly decodable texts. First of all, to know that all texts are decodable because, it's the English language and our language is decodable. And so like you can decode all text, but we're talking about kind of more like they're aligned with the phonics instruction that's taught. And certainly, like for some children, the use of these texts for beginning readers can be really effective, but it should not be the only thing that students read. So things like, the bat sat on the mat and the cat got fat. I mean, they're fine for the purpose of having children apply the phonics elements that you've taught them, but you don't want that to be the only thing that children are reading for reasons that should be pretty obvious. So those are just a few of the falsehoods that I wanted to start with. Let's talk about some others.
Oh goodness, boy, there's a lot on this slide. And I'm probably going to get myself into a little hot water here, but I have to say what I'm going to say. The idea that there are certain trainings or programs that are the magic bullet is especially problematic. We're hearing a lot about letters training, and Orton Gillingham letters training for all elementary students, and certainly Orton Gillingham for those who work with students with severe reading difficulties. We could have a whole other conversation about dyslexia, but I'm not going to get into that here. But it's interesting to consider that if people are relying on research, if science of reading is what people are concerned about, there's no good science behind these programs. Take a look, for instance, at the What Works Clearinghouse, which reports the one study that they could find that met their criteria on the letters program. And it basically, you get the same thing as what Anne described, what you described, Anne, in the Reading First, that it changed sort of what teachers learn, but it didn't change much for kids and how they learn to read. And with Orton Gillingham, I mean, try as people may do, it's hard for people to come up with evidence that Orton Gillingham is effective at teaching kids to learn to read words. And, that this has been going on for decades. And so the idea that these programs are magic bullets is very problematic. So I urge people to get online and look at some of this stuff. I mean, everyone out there would have access to the What Works Clearinghouse, and just look that up. I think you'll be really interested. Earlier, the second point, earlier, Anne, I talked about in the discussion of the National Reading Panel report that, at that time, they shared that systematic phonics instruction was more effective than non-systematic or no phonics. And recently, Jeffrey Bowers had a great research article where he looked at some of the studies of the National Reading Panel report and others, and had this tremendous realization that indeed in research, systematic phonics instruction has never been pitted in a study against non-systematic phonics instruction, but only non-systematic phonics instruction and no phonics lumped together. So the statement that systematic phonics instruction is the most effective way has not been empirically tested. Mm-hmm. As much as we hear that. And that's not to say some kids don't need systematic phonics. They do. But to suggest that all kids need that and it's the only way to teach is terribly misleading. The other thing that I would say is, and I'm hearing this from a lot of teachers out there, and I don't know if you are, that people are being shown in professional development meetings and so forth, graphics of the brain. Neuroscience is telling us how we ought to be teaching reading, and I would say be very skeptical of that. The implications for how we teach reading from neuroscience, that's very limited. I think people would agree. We don't really know much about how instruction. We know that people who have read more, their brains look a little different than people who haven't read as much. But we can change that. When kids actually do learn to read and read more. But in terms of how it impacts our instruction and specifics of instruction, neuroscience doesn't tell us that. Do you want to take this last one?
Yeah, I do. I just want to comment on one thing. So like in talking with teachers anecdotally, like we hear things like, oh, the training that I went to for this program was really engaging and it was interesting. Or, oh, well, I implemented this program with several of my children and they did really well. We're not negating any of that, right? Yeah. Like, we're saying if we look at what the research suggests, we don't have the evidence to say, for example, that these programs will work for all children, that this is the quick fix, the magic bullet for all children. Yes, there are individual children for whom these proposed programs, approaches will absolutely work. That's not the point. The point is be critical consumers of the research, know what the research actually says and does not say. Yeah.
Right. So in other words, if people want to parade these programs around, fine. Just don't parade them around in the name of research evidence.
Right. Know what the research actually says about it. Exactly. Yeah. So kind of in a similar vein, I mean, oftentimes now what's called the simple view of reading is promoted. And, I don't know how many hundreds of models of reading do we have in our field? Just to say, does the simple view of reading, so-called, or the rote model of reading, explain aspects of the way reading works? I suppose so, right? But I think we need to continue to learn about other ways of thinking about reading research, reading instruction, the way reading really does work. And so just to point people, for example, to the new Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright article, what's called the active view of reading, which takes into account some of the notions that were in the simple view of reading, but really thinks about it more critically now, knowing all the research that has evolved since those initial models of reading. So one more, part 3, some of the falsehoods. Gay, I think you wanted to talk about this one, about the how or what children learn versus how or what to teach.
Well, a lot of the sort of research that's being heralded as being the right kind of research to pay attention to is really all about instruction. And instruction is just one piece of the puzzle. I would say more foundational to our understanding of how to teach kids is looking at how and what children learn.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that not everything that's taught is learned, and not everything that is learned is taught. And so I could say a lot about this, but in the interest of time, it's really important to understand those are two really different bodies of literature. They're not unrelated, but missing is research and theory about how and what children learn. And so everybody ought to really be thinking about that. And I think probably those of you out there who maybe teach kindergarten and first grade really think about this a lot, because we know a lot about emergent literacy and over the years and the different ways that kids acquire knowledge, and much of it is not through direct instruction or explicit instruction.
It's important to consider, right? So that whole idea of how and what children are learning is, instead of, like you said, an exclusive focus on how or what to teach. I mean, that's a point that I actually have not heard brought up much, but I think it's a really interesting and important one. And then I just wanted to add too, and it seems like increasingly the emphasis is so much on the terminology, particularly related to phonemic and phonics instruction, rather than actual instructional methods, kind of alluding to your earlier point. So for example, I need to know the difference between an open and closed syllable. I need to know what a digraph is or a diphthong is. Fine, right? Like, it's fine to know what those terms are so that I can talk with educators about those terms. We have this common language, but there's not evidence to suggest that knowing this terminology translates to effective instruction. So just another myth is that, people saying if you know the terminology, you know how to teach it. That's just not the case. And again, I'm not against terminology, but I'm saying there's so much more to effective teaching than just knowing the terminology. And speaking of terminology, another falsehood, this idea of the cueing systems. And boy, has this gotten a lot of press. So the idea that if we would just teach children to focus on decoding words, not guess at words, not use pictures, we would solve all of our reading problems. So I want to make a couple of points on that. And then you also wanted to share some recent research on this. First of all, I want us to think about emergent readers. So children who have not yet developed the alphabetic principle. They don't know the letters of the alphabet yet. You cannot expect emergent readers to be able to decode words because they don't know the letters yet. And so unless you want to deprive young children of reading texts, which we know we do not want to do, we need to teach them all the different ways they can figure out and read words initially. Now, as children go beyond that stage and they know the alphabetic principle, it's a different story, right? Then, yeah, we want them to pay attention to the letters and their sounds, but we also want them to pay attention to not only what looks right, but what sounds right and makes sense. In other words, the cueing systems can be used for self-monitoring to make sure when I decode a word, that word actually makes sense and sounds right and looks right in that particular context. If not, you're just calling words, you're not truly reading. And so, Gay, some recent research that you pointed me to in this area.
Oh, well, I love the research by Donna Scanlon and our own Kim Anderson from East Carolina University. And, they have looked at sort of the importance of using all the available resources for figuring out words. And one of the points that they have made that I think is really useful that I haven't heard made enough is that the point of learning to decode is not to be a good decoder.
Right.
The point of learning to decode is that so words become sight words. You know, as proficient readers, most of the words we see, we know by sight. We're not decoding as we go. We know by sight. And so the point of being able to decode is so that you read a lot and you decode a lot of words. And over time and experience, those become sight words. And so the point of being able to decode is to expand your sight word vocabulary so that you're a fluent reader and you don't have to think about figuring out words. And I think this gets lost in all the arguments about, what are the sources of information that we're allowed to tell kids to use. Yes. I have heard that there are teachers being told that they cannot nudge kids to use meaning or pictures to figure out words. And all I can say is good luck becoming a fluent reader, because it's going to take a long time for those words to become sight words without all of that knowledge. And I really appreciate Scanlon and Anderson's research. I will also say, and we're short on time, but this idea, and this is another myth, the myth that any of the teachers out there watching us and watching this are, and because I've heard this said in public places, that teachers are out there telling kids to look at a picture and guess at a word, and that's the way they're teaching kids to. It's just a myth. I've never seen teachers. I've never seen a teacher doing that. I'm really troubled that that's how hardworking teachers are being portrayed in how they teach reading. I've never seen that happen. That's a myth. The idea that teachers are out there telling kids to look at pictures and guess at words. I think that's another weapon used to politicize this whole business. That's just my opinion.
I appreciate your perspective, and I cannot disagree with you. I think we do not give teachers the credit that they deserve, and that's a whole other presentation. So let's end up here, Gabe. So question 4, what should then we do as educators, as reading teacher educators in this current era? So we've talked about our worries, we've talked about the history, we've talked about some of the many falsehoods that are being perpetuated. Let's end with some action steps. So my big ones are remembering the house and the foundation. So years ago, Haberman talked about a pedagogy of poverty. Alfie Kohn talked about poor teaching for poor children. I am so concerned, again, that in this current era, children, particularly in public schools, are just going to get this foundation instruction and not everything else that they deserve. So making sure that our foundational instruction, and yes, it is essential, phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, are connected with actual reading and writing. So reading out loud to our children every day, engaging in shared reading experiences, having opportunities for lots of small group reading experiences, having children be able to read independently, both at home and at school, and being able to actually write. And you know what, Gay, as you well know, there's as much science behind these structures, the house, as there are behind these foundations of reading as well. So I think your points kind of go beyond the in school to the whole child outside of school.
Well, selfishly, this is the kind of work that I've been involved in the past, 10 years. But, remembering that children who experience difficulty learning to read and write are often the same kids who struggle with stress, anxiety, depression, social difficulties. We're really missing the boat also if not only are we looking at narrow aspects of reading sometimes without looking at the big picture of meaning making, but literacy experiences and literacy instruction ought to also tap into the expansion of all of the breadth of children's development. Yes. They're not as an extra, not as an add-on. But there's socio-emotional skills, self-regulation, their moral and intellectual development. If you haven't read the book Engaging Literate Minds by Peter Johnson and a group of teachers, I think it's a great book because we don't have time to get into this, but that really captures that for the primary grades. And so again, we don't have a lot of time to get into this. We could do another whole session on that, but we can do it simultaneously. kids can develop in these ways through the reading and writing, but it's not going to come from a diet of decodable text.
Yes, right. Yep, it's about the bigger picture. It's about the whole child, exactly. And if some of our audience doesn't know, ASCD, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, talks about the whole child initiative. So being sure that we're emphasizing, particularly now, social emotional learning, holistic supports, the importance of pre-K, really thinking about what happens outside of traditional K-5 literacy instruction matters so much. Culturally relevant literacy instruction matters so much now. And again, this could be a whole other presentation as well, but knowing who our children are, knowing the strengths that all of our children bring from their homes, from their communities, and building upon what Louise Moll calls funds of knowledge, building upon those knowledge bases in our literacy instruction, just essential. And then the big one, and I always do this as kind of like a whisper secret, if we want children to become readers, they need to actually read. And so thinking about text access, not only in school and out of school, and Gay, I know you're doing some really cool work on this right now with preschoolers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I won't get into that. I will say something that drives some of that, and one thing that I worry about, especially as a result of the pandemic, especially lots of kindergartners this year didn't get access to books.
It's true.
And it's true for a lot of kids all of the time who don't have equal access to really great books. And if you haven't experienced books as sort of a joyful meaning-making experience, there's no real incentive or understanding of what it means to learn about the sounds in a word, of manipulating the sounds in a word. I go back to, I think, Don Holdaway said in his book, or he cited somebody else in his book, but the gist of what he was saying was, before kids work with words, they need to work with books.
Yes.
And nothing, and for lots of reasons, not just to learn concepts about print, but that's really important. And I see that falling by the wayside in some places. But having these rich textual experiences with really great books is something that I worried about. There's a new article that I urge everybody to read. It just came out in this Reading Teacher, like today, in this month's Reading Teacher, that asks what happened to shared reading in the era of phonics first or phonics only instruction. It's a really good question.
Right. And so to me, like, the final thing, what we should do, like you said, bring back the joy. I mean, reading is supposed to be a joyful act. And does it take work initially for beginning readers? Yeah, sometimes it does. But, you and I, Gay, are both passionate readers, and reading has truly changed our lives for the better. And we want to bring that joy back from the very beginning for all of our children, because that truly is what they deserve. So just to wrap up for today, we want to thank you for your time and for your attention today, particularly given the year that you have just been through. And we just want to thank you in advance for standing up for what's right for children, for providing and advocating for the quality and equitable reading instruction that all children deserve. So just to be clear, Gay, are we against the science of reading?
No, we're against the science singular. We're against any one particular perspective. And I think that if equity really is important, we better broaden our perspectives.
Yes.
Because equity has never been met with such a narrow perspective.
Yes, absolutely. So the sciences of reading, and we thank you for everything, and we would love to talk with you more. Let's work together as a team to do what is right for all children. Thank you so much for your time today.